How do we best define a good life? What attributes best define a leader? Perhaps there are as many different definitions as the number of people we ask, but one thing is quite certain. We're able to identify it when we see it in someone. That special something that makes us listen to them when they have something to say, or to follow them simply by the way they lead their own lives. Hello, my name is Tim Roach, and today Riverside TV premieres A Good Life. The first in what we hope will be a series of interviews with men and women who have made a significant contribution to the city of Riverside, its people, policies, and profile. People who can truly be said to have lived a good life and have become trusted leaders in our community. And now, today on A Good Life.
He served 32 years in elected office, including 5 terms as mayor, attended 1,500 council meetings and 160 Mayor's Night Out events, gave 13 State of the City speeches, visited 11 countries, worked with 5 city managers, and walked thousands of miles on Mount Rubidoux trails. In addition to a celebrated political career, he will soon mark his 53rd year as a political science professor at the University of California, Riverside, and is the current director of UCR's Center for Sustainable Suburban Development. Now approaching his 80th birthday, he has lost none of the passion and dedication for his beloved city of Riverside. A dedicated family man, he has been married for nearly 60 years to his wife, Marcia. They have raised 2 daughters and now dote on 2 grandchildren. Today, Mayor Ronald Loveridge, A Good Life. To better understand Ronald Loveridge is to understand the America he grew up in, the people who were making news at the time, and the unforgettable events that unfolded around him and shaped an entire generation to honor duty and service. Through America's good times and its bad times. It's also understanding more about those who guided him as a youth, supported and loved him to adulthood, and those who continue to do so today. And by also understanding those who inspired him to a life of public service and action.
Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not.
We recently sat down with Mayor Loveridge for an in-depth discussion of his life and those who helped shape it. Our hope was to go well beyond a list of his accomplishments and find out what he has learned from a lifetime of public service and who his chief sources of strength and inspiration have been, what his hopes are for the city of Riverside, and what advice he has for those seeking a similar path. We will trace his life from the beginning and discuss not only his successes, but what he has learned from some of his darkest hours as well. Mayor Loveridge, welcome.
Well, thank you.
And thank you very much for being here. In our introduction, we mentioned some of your accomplishments. It bears, I think, repeating for our viewers some of the more salient points. Again, not a complete list. That's beyond the scope of this hour. You ran for City Council and won 4 different times. You had an unprecedented 5 terms as the mayor of Riverside. This summer will mark your 53rd year at the University of California, Riverside as professor, where you've taught government, political science, campaigning, public opinion. Your classes are still among the most popular classes on campus. There's a Riverside Renaissance Revitalization Project, 30 years of project work condensed in 5 or 6 years. Most intelligent community, City of Arts and Innovation. We've become synonymous with that term. The Culver Arts Center, the revitalization of the Fox Theater, the RCC School of the Arts, Riverside Aquatics Complex. You've been on any number of boards, commissions, advisory panels. Your advice has been sought out by a number of businesses, individuals, politicians, educators, and so forth. A loving family and a marriage of nearly 60 years to your wife, Marcia. A good life indeed. Let me start by asking you, how you would define a good life?
It's not an easy question. Find something you love. And that is, it seems to me that the good life is one of engagement. It's not one of being on the sidelines, trying to engage and make good things happen. And good things could be found in quite different ways. But I think this idea of finding something you love, being engaged in that, and you need to be engaged, you want to make a difference in something that you love.
Take us back all the way to the beginning. Where you were born, your mom and dad, the community, the family life. Tell us a little bit about the family.
Well, I was born in 1938 and then a very small town of Antioch. My parents were both graduates of the College of the Civic. My dad was a civil engineer for U.S. Steel in Pittsburgh. He began there, finished his work life at Columbia Steel. They moved to when I was 3 to Concord, and which was a agriculture area that was changing itself to become essentially a suburb. The city was, when we went there, was something like Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon. There were the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, and I have no memory of any other. My mother was very active, as my brother and I were, in the Presbyterian Church. And so we grew up in this sort of small town that was sort of expanding in the Bay Area. Sports was an important part of who we are. Mother read. Mother was very active in any kind of choices that women had then. So my parents had both exceptional athletic ability. So that was a major kind of focus of who we are, what we did. Growing up in this kind of small town, when folks moved to Concord, there was like 5,000 people. We had 5 acres where we lived. Dad was a world-class athlete. He actually tied the world record in the 100-yard dash at 9.6 when he was in college without starting blocks. It was this idea of competition, of doing the best you can. I mean, Dad never let my brother and I win anything against him. I mean, we always understood that you need to compete, you need to give the best that you could. And I think Dad, had aspirations for my brother and I to follow him on the track. But I can still remember my dad went out and testing with his stopwatch, and he looked at it and said, well, it's clear my sons have to do something other than be sprinters. And I think on the other end, for my mother, it was one of sort of service. My mother was the political activist. She was initially on a school board in the elementary school I attended. And so my early socialization in terms of kind of political life was listening to my mother and talking to my mother about the school board. It's always a complicated question why you're in politics, but I think my mother's involvement and listening to her and her preparations for speeches and going to school board meetings and going to schools and listening to some of the kind of problems they had, it all seemed sort of possible.
Were you an outgoing young boy? Were you a joiner? Did you make friends easily?
Well, I was probably more, unlike my brother, I was much more of an introvert than an extrovert. I was more a student than although I was involved in athletics, my friends were those which were serious about what took place in the classroom.
Was there any interest in history at that time, historical figures? Any books of interest that you were reading?
Concord had a kind of plaza, and in the center of that plaza was the Carnegie Library, and it was a place that had stacks, as I recall, stacks of books, and I mean, it was something you did on weekends. Your parents took you, and my mother used to hide the books I was reading because she said I wouldn't go to dinner or anything. So but I think that Carnegie Library was a way to be introduced to what was happening around around you, around the past. I was particularly interested in sort of Western American history of the West.
So a middle-class, suburban, Americana upbringing.
Right.
You head to high school. Were there any awkward times where you were insecure about certain things in high school, more so than others?
It was the most difficult year, I think, of my life looking back. One, you're physically, you're not grown, you don't drive a car. We tried one date where my dad drove. That was a terrible experience. The friends I had in elementary school didn't translate well to high school. Where do you eat? What do you do? You're sort of finding your way. And I think it's the freshman year in high school is a difficult year for, I think, sort of anybody, but particularly for a boy.
What did you fill your time with as extracurriculars during high school?
I mean, one, I was on the cross-country team, on the basketball team, on the tennis team, so you spent a lot of time in athletics. And then I was a serious, at least for the most part, a serious student.
So the time comes to apply for college. The University of Pacific is where you eventually went. Were there any other options?
Well, my dad and my mother both went to the College Pacific. My aunt went to the College Pacific. My uncle went to the College Pacific. We used to go to almost all their football games when they had a kind of iconic teams. I never applied, never considered any other place than College Pacific.
Do you have an idea of declaring a major?
Well, I can still see that because when you apply to a university, they ask you, "What do you want to major in?" And I wasn't sure. I knew, at least as a high school student, that I particularly liked history and social studies, and you had this one choice between history and political science. History seemed to me old and a little tired, and political science seemed to be more cutting edge, more interesting, more vital. And so I checked the box political science without really knowing quite what I was checking, but and I stayed with that check that I made as an application when I was a poli-sci major through Pacific and obviously through Stanford.
This is the mid-1950s. Eisenhower is president. The Korean War has ended. A period of happy days, if you will.
My graduation talk, they had about 6 speakers. I was one of them. Marcia still hears it. I began the talk of peace and prosperity exist in the United States. We, the graduating class of 1956, but the words peace and prosperity, and said that, it wasn't with reservation. It just was my best description of the times.
Had you any interest in national politics, the presidency, Eisenhower? Do you recall having any specific passion about the national issues?
Well, you remember the campaigns. You remember the conventions. My parents were intensely partisan Republicans, but my mother was what she called a Earl Warren Republican. But you watch them, but watch them more at a distance. I still remember when Truman fired MacArthur and how the family was sort of appalled by the fact that MacArthur got fired by the president. But it was this, the ideology that my parents was sort of, in some ways, kind of a small town Republican look at national politics.
So at the University of Pacific, you've now selected a course of action academically. Political science is hip. It's something you're interested in. You also meet your wife, Marcia.
There was a choice you had as a student of taking marriage and the family or philosophy, and I wasn't going to be caught dead taking marriage and family. I took the philosophy class, and there was about 20 people in the class. We sat around a circle. Marcia was one of 3 women in that class, and so it was in that class where she sat down beside me, and I said, they have some interest. And so that was how we first met. But it was sort of set our lives in the same direction.
The big decision now is graduate school. How do you choose Stanford? Were there any other options?
I actually graduated #1 in the class from Pacific, and so I thought I had some accomplishments as a student. So it led to the notion of going to graduate school in political science, and so I applied. I can't remember how many schools I applied to. Stanford both accepted and gave a 3-year fellowship.
You arrive at Stanford in the fall of 1960. John F. Kennedy's to be elected a few months later. A lot of potential, a lot of hope.
I was a Republican. My family voted Republican. There was a kind of excitement that I found, a kind of engagement with John Kennedy, and kind of both language and focus that he was bringing to politics. Remember calling up my wife, Marcia, and saying, vote for John Kennedy, and here are the reasons why. Marcia followed my lead on that, but there really was a sense of anticipation and engagement that I think a lot of young people, I was one of those, felt part of that.
And at Stanford now, you're meeting prominent political scientists. You're involved with individuals who have prominent research projects. You're getting direction.
I came there with a 3-year National Defense Scholarship to be a Soviet scholar. And I wrote an MA thesis on Soviet personnel policies. I took a variety of Soviet history courses. I learned enough language. I spent hours and hours in the basement of Hoover Library reading Izvestia and Pravda. But the compelling professor at that time at Stanford was a fellow named Heinz Julau, and he was interested in American politics. He was a behavioralist. He had a major grant to look at the city councils. I became a part of that team, and he asked me if I would essentially study city managers, and so I was part of this look at cities, and particularly city managers. I thought I read everything that anybody had ever written about city managers, which was a deep introduction to cities and what they do and how they do it.
You get your MA in 1961. In 1965, your PhD at Stanford. You're married in 1961 to Marcia. Tell us about that.
You had this sort of intense experience together as a graduate student. Your principal counselor, your principal friend, confidant, companion, and is your wife. And so we had 4 years living at Stanford. Looking back, you value that intense time together. We were looking for an academic career. We had really kind of 2 choices we were looking at. One, North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and the other at UC Riverside. Came here in first time in December of 1964, and flew by helicopter from LAX and landed at Fairmount Park.
You arrive, you accept the job You arrive in the summer of 1965. It's hot.
And very smoggy.
What was Riverside like? What was the campus like? Give us a glimpse of what's going on at the time.
When Marcia and I packed our Volvo up and drove from Stanford on August 13th, we hit Cajon Pass, and he hit this layers of smog, and I said, what is this, and how do people take it? UCR is now 22,000 students. It was then 3,000 or less. I always said it had the resources of the University of California, size of a small college, two best possible kind of combinations. I was chair of the department for a while, and I thought I could name every single poli-sci major as they walked down the hall. We now have 1,000 poli-sci majors. There was intense relationship with the faculty, a very kind of close relationship with the students. You knew who they were and what they were about. And
Vietnam, protests in other universities around the country. What kind of political environment, social protest environment was going on at UCR, if anything, in the mid-60s?
Yeah, I mean, it was the most tumultuous, difficult time, and for universities across the country, and clearly was here. There was a young woman who was walking across campus going to one of the kind of demonstrations, and I can still remember asking her, you know, why? She said, if I don't do this, what will I tell my grandchildren? I mean, there was a sense of students to be engaged and involved. I often use the story of we had a student named Roy Bolton who was going to lead the graduating class, a wonderful guy, had 3 years of fellowship to Stanford Law School. His father would not come to graduation because his son had hair that was too long and was against the war in Vietnam. The son fit the profile of everything you'd want the son to be, but the father, the view of Vietnam and the appearance of his son made it impossible for him to even go to his son's graduation. I still, it was a very tough time.
And the characteristic of Ron's involvement at UC Riverside was the personal attention that he gave to students. He would take students on trips to Sacramento to see California government in action and to Washington, D.C. To see the national government in action. He made endless connections so that students would have opportunities for internships. And those internships shaped the lives of many of UCR's students.
Just a few weeks ago, he had me up at his class at UCR of 30 undergraduate poli-sci students participating in his internship program. And he's doing the same thing with the same energy, the same powerful intellect, the same kindness that he did over 40 years ago. It was remarkable to watch him in front of the class and have an opportunity to share some of my experiences with them.
I met Ron when I arrived at UCR in 1971. He was a professor. I took his class in state politics, and I was extremely impressed by how he listened to students. Most of his professorial approach is that of a listener who nudges and prods a little bit to enable a student to be more eloquent and support their arguments. And because of that great listening capability, he was one of the most popular professors on campus. As the Alumni Association rolls around the country, Ron Loveridge is, without a doubt, the one professor most asked about by UCR alumni.
In 2009, there was a a dinner where they talked about my father and a scholarship, and people talked about how he changed their lives based on their internship. The jobs they got, the experience they had was a direct result of my dad's placement of them, and he was able to place them because he had contacts, he knew these people, and hearing the students talk about him in that way was very rewarding, something I will never forget, hearing them, just how much he inspired them, how they learned from the internships and allowed them to, you know, have a great professional life, basically, because of that. And they were really indebted to him.
From 72, when I ran for the city council in 79, I was on the, what they call the Environmental Protection Commission. We were sort of, I guess, from the council's point of view, kind of a rogue commission, but we were trying to examine growth questions and what quality of life questions for the city, and it was again an important sort of baptism to city politics.
But you're learning city politics. At this time, you have 2 girls now, and you come home one day, perhaps in the late 70s, 77, 78, and tell your wife that you're interested in running for city council. How does that go, and how does that happen?
I don't think I saw myself as a elected official. It's not something I talked to anybody about or particularly saw. The city council was going in directions that made no sense to me in terms of what a view of a good city was. I thought it was a politics of favors, and I'm not really sure when the light went on to say I'm going to run for the city council. I think it just sort of happened, and it happened because of a whole series of kind of forces that, community kind of forces that somehow you became a part of.
And did Marcia feel the same way about that?
Well, in the beginning, this was really a kind of family campaign. She was my treasurer, and you begin all campaigns with sort of a kitchen cabinet. You invite your closest kind of friends and say, well, what do you think, and can you help?
When Ron first ran for office, which I believe was 1979, the first time he ran for the city council, he asked me to be the co-chair of his campaign committee. Ron had a good-sized advisory committee, and he sought our advice and he listened, but he knew a lot more about both the issues affecting the city and how to run a campaign. It was a turning point in the history of the city of Riverside, because there were 4 council members that were on the ballot, and there were 4 good candidates who ran against them. There was a kind of a platform that was developed by the challengers who were discontent and tapped into the discontent of a lot of people in the city about what was happening in City Hall. And all 4 of the challengers won against those 4 incumbents. So it kind of introduced a new era. It inaugurated an era of focus on good government.
Local politics are primarily friends and neighbor politics. It's you're not on television. And you're trying to give kind of messages or reasons why people should vote for you. And I knocked on something like 4,500 doors, I estimate. You're different in that process because each one, you're tutored by them, you hear their life story, what they're interested in, you begin to understand streets and neighborhoods. I had something like 50 coffees. I tried to organize every kind of interest, what I called an interest group that was available in Ward 1. And I ran sort of under the theme of pride in Riverside again, the idea of we need to end the politics of favoritism. Final results were something like 63%.
You win.
I won.
You're on the inside. You're on the city council with a chance to make a difference. You're also a professor, though.
As a councilman, it was not full-time, so it was, and you had a kind of balancing you had to do between demands of the campus and demands of being a council member. Mayor was full-time, although I continued to teach one course a year.
What were the initial frustrations?
Well, one of the things I did when I ran for city council is I had one press release, which was essentially to fire the city manager. So the first thing was to try to change the administration and thus the trajectory of the city. Downtown itself wasn't going anywhere, and it seemed to me really important to revisit the kind of plan that had been approved 5 years before. You worry about neighborhoods, I worry about downtown. There's something kind of exciting about the kind of opportunities that a city presents.
I left for law school and came back to Riverside in the mid-1980s. And at that point, my dad, who was just about 70 years old at the time, decided to run for city council. And it was a fairly interesting, noteworthy campaign, because there hadn't been an African American who had ever served as a city council person in the city of Riverside before. Therefore, endorsements were important. And also, I would say, somewhat controversial. I mean, if you backed an African American candidate and you didn't win, well, you know, it wouldn't look good on you. And Ron Loveridge was one of the first people to endorse my father. He was then a city councilman in Ward 1. I still didn't get an opportunity to work much with Ron after my dad was successfully elected to the city council. But my dad always conveyed good things about him. I heard that he was a thoughtful man, and he was a good man. And I heard the germ of something that later on turned out to be very, very true. In my experience and from my hearing about him in the community, he has a deep and abiding belief that within every community, the things that you need to have a healthy community are present.
You're a councilman, you're a full-time professor, you've got a busy schedule. How does this impact the family? You're spending a lot of time outside the home by necessity. Any strains, any stresses, any additional pressures you feel?
For a spouse, it's difficult because while you're interested in the problems and want to try to do something, they don't have the same kind of involvement. And so when we go places, people want to talk to me about politics. Marcia doesn't. What you've got to be careful of is political life doesn't essentially push away both personal and professional. And you virtually got to have craft time. You got to say, if you don't craft time, the demands of the office simply overwhelm you.
What did you do to get away, to have that quality family time, just the natural time people need?
Well, getting out of town is always helpful because then there's nobody who's sort of asking questions. And we always had trips and vacations to Tahoe and later to Mammoth Lakes. Your wife needs to be, at least Marcia's often tolerant to this, and she had her own kind of interests. She reads widely. She was involved in all kinds of singing groups and newsletters and other organizations, and so she had her own kind of life that she led, in addition to the life yeah. If your wife does not accept choices, then you can't do it. You can't do it.
Time comes when you're starting to decide that you'd like to run for mayor. Take us through that.
In politics, they often say that the single most important people to you are the people who are there when you decide to run. Who's at the kitchen table? And there's, for the rest of your political life, you're sort of indebted to those people who are at, so to speak, at the kitchen table.
Yeah, you might know that I replaced Ron on the city council when he became mayor. In fact, I had just retired from the school district when he called me and said, I know you've just retired. How about helping me on my campaign? And I said, of course I would. And the kind of meetings that were held in connection with that show you the kind of character that Ron had. He's very, very much on topic. He has character like I don't think anyone I have met before.
One thing I regularly did was a council member, is I had an advisory group that met every week and sort of looking for their opinions and judgments on things. One of the questions that's I think important about elected official is under difficult times, who do you look to? Who do you talk to? Jane Carney, who was my campaign manager when I first ran in '79. She and Francis lived in the house right above us. I spent many evenings in their living room talking about council politics and talking about, when the mayor opportunities came. A fellow named Roger Lebs, who's now a judge, a former student, was always central in these early choices. Art Littleworth, an attorney, was somebody that I, particularly as mayor, but I would, in difficult times, would talk to. There were colleagues and Francis and others at the department who I knew cared about politics that you would talk to.
And Mrs. Loveridge is still on board?
I'm not sure she would be the most exciting choice, certainly one that she wouldn't make, but no, she was there. If in the end, if your wife says no, you say, Marcia used to ask me, what am I going to do today? I said, I have no idea, because your schedule is made up by others, and so you get a schedule handed to you. I mean, obviously you have some influence over it, but essentially my choices were made by others every day. And,
so you run for mayor. Is it as focused and as passionate and as dedicated a campaign as the first one for council?
Well, it's a different, you run from a district to a city, a fairly, Riverside's now about the 60th largest city in the country. So it's a, cities go, it's more than a middle-sized city. It's not quite a big city, but there's a lot of folk. It's what difference you want to make, what kind of, for the good city, what kind of outcomes are you looking for? Put together a booklet that I first ran of renewing Riverside, Pride and Get in Place. They had something like 28 action steps. I've looked back at that booklet. We've got maybe 25, 26 of these. Worked hard, tried to, again, to look to different groups. So yeah, running for mayor, walked a lot, had to raise money. I don't know how much we raised then, but raised quite a bit of money, because you have to get in mailboxes, not simply in a small ward, but across the city.
And you win again, and now you're mayor. Is there a moment when you walk into the office and think either, what have I gotten myself into, or a moment of unusual stress and fear?
I was, quite frankly, excited almost every day I went to the mayor's office. You knew that you didn't always get to where you wanted to go. You don't have overnight improvements, but you have incremental. And then you focus on things that can make a difference for the city. And so we established something called Mayor's Night Out. We went to, over time, 163 different Mayor's Night Out in different neighborhoods across the city. And part because that's the way what a city is made up of neighborhoods, and they're all somewhat different. They need to be understood and respected. And it's the litmus test of services. It's where quality of life is experienced. It's interesting. Most politicians who've been mayor, if they look back at what office they liked the best in their life, they like being mayor. You're one person. You're not. I use the story. It was once a salesman at Nordstrom was waiting on me, and he asked me who I was. After I said I was a professor at UCR, and then I said. He kind of nodded his head and so forth. And I said I was mayor of the city, and well, he's mayor of the city. And the title allows you to invite people, to call people, and they pay attention to the title.
What were early frustrations, challenges?
One of the things you would hear again and again at City Hall was somebody would say, Loveridge, there were two things you hear. One, Loveridge, that's not the way we do things here. And I'd say, well, it's true, but maybe there are other choices and other alternatives. I'd also hear at times people would say, well, Loveridge, that's not a perfect plan. I'd say, well, it's not perfect, but it helps move the ball down the court. I guess if there's frustration, sometimes you can't move quite as quickly or as adeptly as you would like in terms of focusing attention or resources. The great advantage of serving over time in Riverside was that you were able to identify best practices that made sense for the city and had time enough to see them take form here.
Ron is one of the few elected public officials I've ever met who not only has a value system, but it's a value system that's based upon the best ideals of what we can do and what we can become. An incredibly, obviously intelligent man. A man of a very, very deep belief in what's good in us. I'm talking about the person who's willing to row, to put your paddle in the water and try and move the community ahead.
How difficult is the coalition building, the relationship building?
Well, there are 7 city councilmen. They're all different. You need to sort of understand and respect them. You don't vote. You don't appoint boards and commissions. You don't have anything to do with the budget. You don't have anything to do with council committees. You don't have anything to do with the selection of the city manager. We have council manager cities. The manager worries about providing services. You're worrying more about larger issues and managing conflict and establishing directions. You're really the kind of facilitator. You're really trying to bring people together. And I think that the primary task of a mayor and a council manager for a city is to bring people together and then to look for best practices. That's the call of, you want to be the best city manager can, I want to be the best mayor I can. What can I do to help you? What can you do to help me? And let's try to do it together.
People committed to making the community a better place, committed to working together towards common goals, committed to getting over their differences and finding consensus. It's remarkable the results we've experienced in the areas of the arts, in the areas of redevelopment, in the areas of education, in all the areas that contribute to the quality of life of our community. He's helped build the civic capital that made that possible.
You mentioned detractors earlier, and you could instinctively understand what they were trying to get across. You were able to handle them because of your background as an academician. But the family, it's different.
Yeah, that's right.
The children, it's different. These are school-age, now high school-age children, impressionable. They're reading someone saying something about their father. Someone is saying something about the husband.
I think it's, in our terms, much more stressful on the wife than it was on John or Kelly. And the quick answer, it's not easy. I think for Marcia is that she did not want to, research all the disagreements that you get impacted by them, but you don't mire yourself in these. I think it's easier for the person in office than it is for the spouse.
It's not a conventional job. It's 7 days a week. My guess would be 10 hours a day or more. You're consistently a mayor.
Right, 7:30 to...
It's consistent mayor. And you have a family at home doing their thing as well.
He wanted to be home for Marcia and the girls. He wanted to make sure that he spent quality time at home. And although it was a constant struggle to divide his time in City Hall with his time with the family, I know that he tried very hard to give back to his family what he felt that they deserved. As much time as he could possibly spare, sometimes cutting meetings short, sometimes just saying, look, I have to leave.
You get through the first term and you decide a second term. Were there any thoughts of one term was enough?
Well, I think when I first ran, I thought about running one term and then going back to being a professor, and then there's a, I mean, it sounds trite, but there's a kind of unfinished agenda. There's things you wanted to do, and as I went from sort of the second term, then I began to be much more actively involved in the League of California Cities, and I got involved in the National League of Cities, and then you had different kind of appointments that took you to kind of new kind of challenging places, and
you're starting to travel, you just mentioned. You're taking it on the road for Riverside. You're starting to get some flack at home with some councilmen, some individuals who are saying now the mayor is away.
And Marcia and I, when we go different places, it's just sort of a comparison. You're trying to say what works here, what's interesting, what makes this city vital, or why is this downtown taking off, or how is this neighborhood served, or how did this high-tech emphasis take place, or what's the nature of this museum? And when you see other places, you ask how. You compare it back to your own town and wonder what you can do to bring it back. One of the things I'm quite proud of in the city is we have the 311, one call does it all, and we have 200,000 calls now a year. Well, I heard that idea in Edmonton, Canada, but it's just an illustration of a kind of best practice that you try to adopt and take form in your own city. I mean, cities are policy laboratories. They're best practices. You don't have to rediscover the wheel all the time. You know, what's out there, what's been tried, what seems to be working. But no, if we have had sister city trips, we're always asking why is somebody going to visit another country when you should be staying home and fixing potholes. Cities are not walled places. They don't have moats around them. The resources, the success of cities are what happens outside, or much of the success is what happens outside the borders or boundaries of a city. Mayor has a particularly important role to play in this intergovernmental, regional world stage, and had an honor and opportunity to do that here.
In the time that we worked together, the experience, I think, I'll never forget were the two trips we made together to Sendai. The first of those included the Roberts, as well as some other figures, people from the city. We were both together with the Robertses in the parade in Sendai when Dwayne said, you know, we're going to have something in Riverside far exceeding what they've ever thought about. And of course, what happened was a thing called the Festival of Lights. It would not have happened, I think, without Ron, who behind the scenes very much got the city involved in so many ways. He could, I think, see, and he's a visionary, I understand. He could very much could see that that's a signature piece, even then, for the city of Riverside.
Was there any merit to those who said that there was a lot of planning, there was a lot of research, there was a lot of focus groups, but not as much implementation as we perhaps could have had? Was there any merit to those?
Loveridge created another task force. What is it going to do? No, sure. As mayor, you don't have much by way of staff. You don't have much by way of authority. You can't move resources around. So how do you try to focus and dramatize and understand alternatives or choices or policies? You do it by getting people together to talk about it.
He kept calling these panels together, and we would jokingly say, well, he's going to call another group together, but Ron believed in us, all of us.
If there were a kind of a model for the kind of character that you would want in a civic leader, it would be Ron Loveridge. He is the definition of a servant leader, one who leads not for any personal power or prestige or to acquire anything other than the satisfaction of having served his community.
No meaningful discussion about Ron Loveridge would be complete without including the one person who has been at his side throughout his entire adult life. We sat down with Marcia Loveridge at their beautiful home in downtown Riverside's Mount Rubidoux Historic District and spoke with the couple about their life together. Described universally by friends and family as a private individual, she spoke candidly and openly of their joys and also the special challenges she has faced, helping to forge the life of service they have shared together.
Mrs. Loveridge, thank you for having us into your lovely home. The mayor and I have been talking about his life, strolling through the years from his earliest childhood. And over the last 60+ years, one name continually gets mentioned, your name. You are the thread that tied all of the fabric of his life experiences together. Let me ask you first how you would define a good life.
I think, of course, family. I think it's very important that whatever you choose to do should be something that you love to do. I think a good life is one where you've contributed something to make society better and also had a good time.
Tell us how you met the mayor.
We both attended University of Pacific, which at that time was College of the Pacific in Stockton. Ron's parents both went there, and he was a year ahead of me. And one of the weird requirements of the college was you had to take either marriage and family or philosophy. You had to choose one of those courses. And so Ron tells me he wouldn't be caught dead in the marriage and family class. And I thought, oh, it sounds like a real Mickey course. So we ended up in this philosophy class, which I think is about 15 students.
3 girls.
Mostly really nice, intelligent boys, young men. And we sat around in a circle and talked about, you know, the great mysteries of life and so forth. But I guess one day I sat down next to him. I don't know how intentional that was, but later he said that was a kind of, maybe she thinks I'm okay kind of thing. He was pretty shy about girls, you know.
Yeah, the 2 other kind of interesting complications of the class that Marcia didn't mention. One was she was actually going with the son of the professor earlier, right?
The first semester I was dating this philosophy professor's son and had broken up with him.
So that was one complication.
Yeah.
And the lowest grade Marcia got was in this class. The lowest grade that I got was in this class. So.
What qualities impressed you most about him?
Well, he was cute. He was smart, and he was active on campus. So I knew a little bit about him. And as I said, I knew he was kind of shy about asking girls out. He wanted to be sure they would say yes.
Was his passion for public service evident early on?
I guess it was, because he was active in different organizations on campus. We were both in the YMCA program, and eventually, you know, he ran for student body president, and I should have been clued in right then that maybe this is something different. But
You graduate from College of the Pacific. The mayor moves on to Stanford. You go with him. You're married in 1961. Joan is born in 1963.
Well, Marcia graduated in '61. A week later, we got married in Willow Glen.
And then in August of 1965, you come to Riverside. A bit different from Palo Alto.
yes.
What were the early challenges as a family, as a mother of a young child, as a wife, to get acclimated to the community? What was the community vibe at the time, and what special challenges existed as a family?
Well, several things helped us, I think, socially. One was the department, poli-sci department was very close. There were, what, about 12 professors?
We met every Friday evening.
Yeah, they became our friends. And we joined the local Methodist church there, Grace Church, by the campus. And so we met people there.
It was also the apartment. I mean, we were in an apartment with a bunch of people who looked like us, had kids about our age. Many of them were involved in faculty at UCR, and so it was. I mean, I think there was you had a chance to.
It was good. We had a babysitting co-op we set up, and we'd take turns watching each other's kids.
My husband, Francis Carney, was at UCR in the political science department from the time that the campus opened in 1954. So he was on the committee that hired Ron Loveridge. Ron was just coming out of Stanford, finishing up his PhD, and Francis was on the committee that hired him, and then Ron and Marcia, who had been college sweethearts and were just newly married, moved into an apartment very close to where Francis lived. So Francis and Ron and Marcia Loveridge were very good friends from the time they arrived in Riverside. Francis would often talk about how much fun he had talking with Ron in the halls of the poli-sci department.
The mayor has talked extensively about some of the folks that inspired him. Robert F. Kennedy on May 29, 1968, a little bit more than a week before he was assassinated, came to visit Riverside. I was wondering if you would share with us your contact with the senator that evening.
Yeah, that's a special story. We went to he spoke at the municipal auditorium. It was just wall-to-wall people. When he started speaking, the crowd just kind of moved in, and you virtually couldn't move. It was really amazing. And so he spoke, and people kind of dispersed a little bit. We kind of wanted to get out of the crowd, so we walked over by the Mission Inn and just stood there by the Orange Street entrance and kind of watched, people kind of gathering. And the next thing we knew, the car came by, with Kennedy and Ethel and Rayford Johnson and Rosie Greer. And it was like, oh boy, And the people were kind of, grasping. And so I was just standing there watching, and it was like he just reached over all those people and took my hand and said, "Thank you for coming." And so it was a very memorable moment.
Your husband's decision to enter public life, elected politics eventually, is a sacrifice for any spouse. So we understand that as citizens. Would you tell us specifically what some of these chief sacrifices are?
Long time, 33 years, Marcia.
Yeah, I guess initially I didn't really think that much about it, but you start getting phone calls, that was before even answering machines, but you get in politics, and you become public property. And as I said about the phones, he would be gone all day, and so I would get the phone calls. Our numbers in the phone book, and and people would be really angry about something. And so, you know, by the time he got home and I had him call them back, they'd kind of settled down, and, you know, it wasn't quite so bad. But I mean, some people were, I mean, I'd get off the phone and I would just be...
The problem Marcia had is that people vented, and I could try to solve the problems. Marcia basically...
I just had to listen to them rant and rave.
I mean, that is one ability elected officials have, is to try to take the kind of complaints or requests and kind of figure out what to do with it. And so I would pick them up after Marcia had listened to their initial kind of, and maybe it was unfair to Marcia, but at least one premise I had is I wanted my phone to be public phone. Rather than just simply call City Hall, they should have the opportunity to call me directly. And so it was at least in my judgment, a decision to have a kind of private access as well as a City Hall access.
Now, by all accounts, you are a very private person. You are content with not being recognized in public. That's fine with you, and certainly not somebody that clamors for public attention. So how do you make that square with the fishbowl you mentioned that is elected politics?
Well, we're both introverts, and that may be surprising to some people about Ron, but I went to a lot of events and I met a lot of people, and I'm not an unsociable person.
We had one rule about it was Marcia's choice for almost whether or not she could go to an event or not, and I had told enough people that, and so I didn't. When I show up, they say, "Well, Marcia didn't think this was an event worth coming to." So that was at least one explanation that was not helpful.
You're walking down the street, and all of a sudden, well, where is he? Somebody stopped to talk to him, and you go shopping, and somebody wants to talk to him about some issue or whatever, and so you just give up a lot of your own time and your own privacy.
Marcia Loveridge is a very private person. She did not want to be a person who would be recognized if she went to the grocery store. She never wanted to be in a spotlight for any reason. And I think that Ron's involvement in public offices cost her a lot. But she was very loyal. She was very loyal to Ron, and she saw what this meant to Ron. And Ron did these things out of idealism, and I believe she really respected that. And so she made enormous personal sacrifices so that Ron could continue to do this important public work.
So with all this experience, what advice do you give a spouse who is perhaps married to somebody who wants to be in public service or elected office?
Well, I think you need to have a fairly thick skin, which I don't really have. I think you have to be committed to that this is important and that you're going to make sacrifices, but in the end, it's worthwhile.
The mayor and I were talking about detractors the last time, and although he could handle the situation with his knowledge of what they were about, he said that it was always more difficult on you because some of these people spew such vitriolic, borderline hatred, personal comments. You must get angry. And how do you work through that?
Yeah, it's anger and frustration, and there's not much you can do about it.
The people really are kind of excessive comments are at the boundaries or at the margins, and at least in political life, I was also struck by how many people you know, there are the Marcia mentions people that complain. There are also any number of people who offer comments or offer support or thank you for making a difference in a neighborhood or making a difference on requests or making, I mean, there is community support in addition to, it isn't all a series of people.
Well, and yeah, and you probably got less of that than most. You know, you were pretty much well liked. So, you know, that it's just my nature, you know, to take things personally. Almost like anybody complained about anything about Riverside, I would sometimes take it personally, and that's not good, you know.
People tend to think that when you're a public person, you can talk, you can say whatever you want about them. Yeah, it is hard. It's hard to have people be critical of someone that you care about. That was something that was hard.
Well, Marcia had this singing group that was her kind of support group that they met every week. They shared, they talked. I mean, that was an important support group for you, right? Through almost the entire.
When
did the group start?
1970.
And
the Why Nots. There were 8 women. We were together for over 40 years. So that was very helpful. And the singing, you know, music is a great stress reliever.
We get to 1998, which is in many ways a horrific year for Riverside. In January of 1998, Riverside School Board has an open meeting to discuss the naming of a new high school in town after Martin Luther King Jr. The meeting devolves somewhat into a charged discussion at best. Mr. Mayor, do you remember your feedback on that and what your thoughts were at the time?
There were kind of difficult undercurrents of that discussion and that exchange. I mean, remember one of the comments was, we name it Martin Luther King High School, none of the students will ever be able to get into college. I mean, a series of comments that had no basis in kind of accuracy, and this question of facts and truth were important to me as an academic. They were important to me as an elected official.
A couple months later, good news. Riverside is awarded a prestigious designation of All-America City. 19,000 communities in America, towns and cities, 30 finalists.
I mean, I had three political heroes in my life: Bob Kennedy, Henry Cisneros, and Bill Bradley. And so we were the 6th of the 10 cities announced. We had a chance to go forward and shake the hand of Senator Bill Bradley from New Jersey. I can still remember the handshake in that moment.
A few months later, on October 6th, a few minutes before 8 a.m., you're preparing, like you have done many times before, for a meeting at City Council. In a room outside of City Council, a gunman, an African-American man, enters the room and starts firing shots without saying a word. You are struck in the shoulder and neck region, if I'm not mistaken. Councilman Chuck Beatty is wounded.
Yeah, badly wounded.
Mrs. Loveridge, you're at home, perhaps taking a walk. Tell us how you found out that your husband was actually shot with a 9mm handgun.
Well, actually, I wrote a letter to the editor. I don't know if you've seen that, yeah. And I was walking Mount Rubidoux, my usual walk, and I came around the bend and I could hear helicopters and fire engines and sirens, and I thought, oh boy, there must be a terrible fire going on somewhere. And I got home, and Ron's, what was their title?
Report to the mayor's office.
Ann Gore,
Executive Assistant.
Executive Assistant Ann Gore came to the door, and she said, Ron's been shot, and he's okay. So she took us down to the hospital, and he was sitting there. The bullet went through the side of his neck. He had about 18 stitches. You know, if it had been half an inch farther in, I think it would have been disastrous. But he was okay. They had stitched him up, and you know, we got the blood on the jacket and the shirt and all that.
Well, you should mention, Marcia, we have a whole box full of letters, of notes, from people from childhood, almost every walk of life that I've experienced, Marcia, all making contact. I mean, it was stunning, the kind of personal response from members in this community and outside.
Accepting that it happened, and actually, you know, nobody was killed, and you go on. You know, you still have work to do, and so that was kind of the message. But yeah, the people were wonderful. It just was a great outpouring of affection, and so that was the good part of it. You know, he couldn't, we brought him home, but he couldn't stay here, you know. He had to go back to City Hall to answer questions and all that.
In almost no time, later that day, as hundreds of media representatives were clamoring for news of what had happened in City Hall, Ron Loveridge, in a Hallmark blazer, walked into the TV shot and addressed the city and, by transference, the country, to tell them what was going on at Riverside.
Can you even verbalize what goes through someone's mind when they don't know whether they're going to live or die at that moment?
Well, you know, I guess I was his target of first choice. I remember this loud noise. I first thought somehow it was an earthquake or something, but I found myself under the table. I mean, this whole incident lasted less than 18 minutes, so you're not talking about hours. The reason that those of us in the room are alive is because particularly Chris Manning judged us not as a hostage, but as a chance that if it took a hostage strategy, I wouldn't be here. But they essentially attacked the door. But I remember thinking Thornton Wilder's Our Town, somehow being there but not being there. That was Our Town is what came to mind. And for me, it was he had written on the board his reasons for doing this, and so I remember hearing, and I remember him loading up his gun. I remember him watching. I never could see his face because I was around the table. I watched him take tape and tape the doors, so he was really taping himself in. He was creating a tomb, was my judgment. But then when he finished writing his message on the blackboard, that's when he grabbed me by the belt, and he was pulling me out from under the table. And I said, well, that's it. I'm just gone. And about that exact time, the police hit the door. He dropped me and fired away at the people at the door. But I mean, again, we're talking about the first shot, so fractions of seconds making some difference in whether you're alive or not.
1998, we were together in a room in which the man entered with a 9mm and decided to end city government, in effect. But when he first entered the room, everyone says, hit the floor under the table. And so Ron and I ended up next to each other for what seemed like a lifetime, but in reality was probably 10 minutes, but of the whole affair.
Marcia, you mentioned the letter, which I have a copy of, and I'd like to read the last sentence. It's very poignant, it's beautifully written, And you write in this letter, those whose lives were spared on Tuesday have work left to do, and the people of Riverside will be with them to do it. This is a great city. Thank you all. The outpouring we mentioned earlier of love and affection, the hugs on the street, the tears, were real. The regular folks, the citizens in Riverside, were moved. You survived the quick action of the police. You lived. Chuck Beatty had some serious injuries, and he is alive today. Just 83 days later, a 19-year-old African-American woman from Rubidoux is gunned down 2 in the morning on December 28, 1998.
On Magnolia Avenue.
A young African-American woman named Taisha Miller unfortunately was involved in a police killing. The community was in an uproar. And Mayor Loveridge then needed to deal with it. You know, you wonder how you will respond in times of real adversity. And that was a serious time in this city. There were many people from outside the community flying in, making statements, taking platforms. We were in the national news, and Riverside was not being portrayed well. Ron did things that a lot of his predecessors didn't have the internal mechanisms to do. I'm trying to be gentle. He did things like immediately go to the African American churches. He met with anybody who wanted to meet with him.
It became very apparent this was not a case of shooting. This was a major event in the city's history, and a very difficult one.
Race relations were not the best they could be in Riverside. There was some angst. This situation was frightening in that some thought it might be a powder keg, a Rodney King situation. That did not happen.
You wanted to try to figure out solutions, and became just that the issues were very difficult, and there was immense emotion around them, and so to bring people. I mean, my whole life in politics is try to bring people to the table and try to figure out solutions, and this didn't really lend itself to bringing people to the table. You went out and listened. I mean, I think we went as much listening as we did talking.
Ron went with Council Member Emil Moore, and I think Chuck Beatty was involved in some of these meetings, but he went to many meetings on the East Side and elsewhere in African American churches to let people talk about this, about what their own experiences had been with police, what their views were about this, and I believe that the fact that people were listened to and that there was going to be a city response helped keep peace, and to some extent made it a time of healing in the city rather than a time of further division.
I remember going to meeting after meeting in the churches of the city. Churches felt a very important part of that. I kind of followed along, but Ron went to all of those, and it indeed made a difference. We held together, and I think everyone knew that how sorry we were as to what happened. It was unfortunate, but I think without Ron's leadership and without that background in our population, Riverside would have been another LA.
What do you take away from that on different levels?
Well, I guess two things. I mean, one, inside City Hall change is that in many ways the city attorney took the lead in this, and I think that in retrospect it should have been the electeds rather than the city attorney. I think that's one takeaway. The other is this really neat. I mean, it emphasized this community needs to be together as a place. We share this same neighborhoods. We share the same hopes. We need to be connected in these sort of connected ways. And so, if there is an incident, it's in the context of a community that cares, as opposed to a community which is sort of divorced and separated from each other. And in retrospect, I think we could have made some better choices than we did, but the outcomes of this became some major reforms of police and police tactics and police organization. We created a use of force panel, which Jack Clark sort of headed, which I think it had 12 recommendations, which I think offered a kind of bridge into a better future. Jerry Lauder, Pastor Lauder, was very helpful in this. Over time, I think we learned from the death and in terms of how the city, one, responded, but particularly the approach and culture of the police department.
Marcia, how do you tune things out? How do you relax?
Well, that's another thing that becomes sort of difficult is, you know, you have a council meeting every Tuesday, so that limits your time, vacation time. I guess in the late 80s, we discovered Mammoth Lakes, and so we've been going up there every year. It gets a little bit longer every year, and on the 26th of June, we head up 395 for 3 weeks there, which is just supposed to be rest time, away time. Yeah, reading, music, but you know, it just, especially as mayor, there wasn't a lot of time that wasn't taken up by the city. You know, I think once I figured out, well, he earns $12 an hour for what he does. You know, it's like 80-hour weeks. And so you just get used to that. You know, I got used to doing a lot of things by myself. And, you know, our lives would connect at certain points, and we'd do some things together. The day after Christmas, he would start writing his State of the City speech, so there was no opportunity, you know, to take advantage of holiday vacation.
You know, when we focus on Ronald Loveridge, we tend to focus on the politician, Mayor Loveridge. Yet he's been Professor Loveridge for longer. And you've been witness to that as well. Talk a bit about how you've seen him inspire and mentor these young students and how meaningful that has been.
Well, right from the beginning, it was never just, you know, go to the classroom, give your lecture, and that's it. He always wanted to have the opportunity to actually change these young people's lives. So he was good about office hours, and I think right from the start we would have students come over to our house, and eventually his intern students always came for dinner. In fact, we just had some week or so ago, we have 4 nights in a row of 12 students each night, and right now he's reading their papers and their experiences, which he shares with me, and it's just very life-affirming. I do want to say, you know, it sounds like, you know, it wasn't a very always a happy experience, but he's really good at what he does. And so I have to weigh that as part of the price to do those good things. And he loves doing it, so, you know, who am I to say? And believe me, I tried, but...
He, kind, generous, intelligent, hardworking, and a man of impeccable integrity. And he's absolutely uncorruptible.
You've been together for more than 60 years. You were married in 1961. Your 57th wedding anniversary is coming up. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, how do you make that happen?
Well, the person I fell in love with in Pacific was smart and talented and interesting. And I think if you fall in love with somebody who's smart and talented, interesting, that it increases the chances for a long marriage. That might.
Yeah, I think choosing the right person is the first step. I think we have shared values. That's also important. We've kind of worked out our, you know, who's in charge of what kind of thing. I'm in charge of everything, and he's in charge of everything else. You know, his work and his city. I handle all the finances and, you know, everything that needs to be done to keep a household going. And so he doesn't have to worry about a lot of things like that.
Which also you're very good at.
Yeah, I guess.
My mom and my dad had a great relationship. They like to joke together. They like to be affectionate together. You know, it was nice. It was nice to see that. My mom wasn't working outside the home. She was taking care of us. She was taking care of the things that my dad was too busy to do.
Marcia, when she balances the budget, it's one of those kind of satisfactions. So that she always says,
yes,
I've done it again, that the budget's balanced.
The checkbook.
Yeah,
I don't know. We appreciate each other's quirks or whatever. We don't watch television together because he wants to watch totally different things than I do, and vice versa. So one thing we do really enjoy is walking. In college, neither one of us had a car, so we walked a lot. And you walk and you talk and you share, and that was always, that's just continued to be an important thing in our lives, because it's time away from everything else.
Is there anything that people would be surprised to know about the mayor?
Surprised? What, you didn't read my 10 things? The one that got the biggest laugh, I think, at the retirement ceremony was that his favorite movie was Animal House. But because Ron is just so unlike, you know, the guys at the Animal House. But he's very, he loves adventure stories and movies. Right now he's into Westworld. Every Sunday night at 9. Now he's there watching Westworld. He really likes music a lot, but can't carry a tune. So, which is too bad, because his mother was a very talented musician. And
Angelic, even my dad, who...
Yeah, his dad couldn't even recognize the Star-Spangled Banner virtually, so, but... And this is really odd. When he's working, he has music going all the time. Not just background music, but, you know, Simon and Garfunkel and Judy Collins and, you know, these favorite singers. And he says he can concentrate better with that going on. And I'm thinking, that would just drive me crazy. So, you know, you tend to accept those little differences. And
he has brought to City Hall a professor's wardrobe. When it's summertime, Ron likes to wear sandals and shorts. When it's wintertime and he is in long pants, he, for some reason, doesn't really care for suits. We always have talked about the 20 or 30 blazers he must have in his closet, because almost invariably, unless the occasion requires a very different mode of dress, as mayor, Ron would be in a blazer and slacks. I'm not sure that he really understands why people kid him about that.
So my dad liked to tease. He would tease my mom. He would tease my sister and I. I remember saying, if you tease me one more time, I'm going to run away. And then he kind of said, oh, you need some help packing?
He's very appreciative. He's very rarely critical of anything I do. So that's a wonderful thing. You know, I know there are lots of couples where, you know, there's a lot of criticism and tension and that kind of thing. But he really appreciates me, I think, and what the life that we've worked out together.
Well, you know, the good life question you began with is really kind of, you know, I mean, Marcia's, I always call her the younger woman, but she's 1 year younger than I am. But we've had opportunity. I mean, you mentioned the length of marriage, but our health has been reasonably good. We've been relatively stable in terms of kind of financial, business. I mean, if you look at your life, in many ways, we've sort of blessed is a kind of a throwaway phrase, but it's. And Marcia's done much of what she's wanted to do in life, and I've done much of what I've wanted to do in life, and that's not opportunities that many people, or at least I don't think most people have that kind of opportunity that we've had over now nearly 8 decades.
We were both from very stable families. Neither one of our families was, when we were real, you know, middle class, 50s kind of growing up, we never had to worry about things, money, and you know, whether your parents were getting along, and things that a lot of people have to deal with that are difficult.
On the money thing, my mother used to say, Ron never worries about money, and that's probably true.
No, he doesn't. He has no idea. He never knew how much he made or what happened to it. Or
Marcia's essentially been the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Yeah, I would negotiate to buy the cars and all those things. He just didn't want to bother with that. He had too many other important things to do.
In your last State of the Union address, you did mention these political heroes. You mentioned Robert Kennedy, who we've already covered. You mentioned Senator Bill Bradley of New Jersey and Henry Cisneros. What was it about Senator Bradley specifically that made him a political hero?
One sort of admired his basketball career at Princeton, and then what he came with the Knicks. But he was a Rhodes Scholar. He was a very, very bright guy, and I thought he raised the intellectual, conceptual level of I mean, he was interested in complex, serious matters, and I guess I shared the kind of values that he had, but it was his sort of kind of intellectual prowess that I particularly was caught by. He was also a skillful politician, but so it's that that's what I particularly, I think, is intellectual values and analysis that he brought to politics. And we miss that now, but I thought that's why I liked. And Cisneros was I think, one of the extraordinary mayors in the last half of the 20th century, and I admired what he did in San Antonio. I admired the kind of values he brought to local politics, the kind of vision that he brought to his city and to other cities. So those three, if I had to identify three, those were mine.
You also spoke about how proud you were of the civility. You used that word, the civility of the city of Riverside. Depending on who you ask today, we have a complete and utter lack of civility at some levels.
I mean, it's essentially, one of the complications now is much of communication is through the internet, which I mean, I've sort of favored social capital and the idea of face-to-face interactions and what that's done. Increasingly, we engage others not face-to-face, but on our cell phones. The call I would make is to come out of your home, put your phone down, and join others and work on common projects and talk to each other. I mean, civility is a matter of talking to each other.
And listening.
And listening. And moving away from kind of hard caricatures or stereotypes in politics and sharing. But listening, we always make the point to students that we teach students how to write. We don't teach people much how to speak, and we never teach them how to listen.
What advice are you giving your students, or young people in general, who want to seek a similar path as yours, perhaps academics, political life?
Well, you got to test. I mean, I think this is sort of, the university is sort of a testing time, but you test yourself out, find out what you care about, what you're passionate about, what you're good at, and in political life, there's a whole variety of ways you can sort of test yourself. There are campaigns all around you. You can see, I mean, the question, please vote for me, is a very powerful question. Why do people vote for someone? I mean, it's an academic question, but it's also obviously a political question. And then it does get to this, what do you want to do with your life? How do you want to make a difference? And I finish my discussions now with the students that we have with the question, what difference do you want to make with your life? Leaving UCR, you're about to leave UCR, how are you going to change the world? What difference do you want to make? And political life and political office offers opportunities to do that in many ways that you can't find elsewhere.
Regrets, professionally first. Was there something that, when you're walking, that constantly comes through? I could have pushed that through. We should have done this. What comes to mind 6 years after the political life?
As I look back, there were two things. I mean, I thought the mayor should vote, and never could. Thought a mayor should vote when I was a member of the council, and thought a mayor would vote when I was mayor, and never could persuade the council members that that was a good idea. And then I also thought, I mean, I deeply believe in the importance of neighborhoods. I mean, it's where you live, or it's where your family is, where your kids are raised, where you have your biggest personal investment, where quality of life is experienced, city services are experienced. And I think I would have liked to have the city have a more organized neighborhood structure, and but it too, council members, to oversimplify, would say, why do you need a neighborhood structure when you have me? And I had a tough time trying to get 4 or 5 votes to a neighborhood structure.
Privately, regrets. Was there a time when you thought, perhaps I'm away a lot?
Don't regret taking the philosophy class and marrying Marcia Jean White. Have no regrets that I came here, and Francis Carney talked about the university and, in some sense, politics of this this place. I mean, you always could make some different tactical choices, but I've been very, very fortunate in terms of support and opportunities.
Approval ratings for members of Congress at an all-time low. Been trending down for now a couple of generations, actually. Partisan politics perhaps off the rail. There seems to be no reasonable and practical solution to this.
I tell students, move away from the international, national scene. Look kind of locally is where you have the greatest impact on quality of life, on economic development. And I think at times we get caught in these sort of cable chatter and which accentuate differences rather than joining together on what we have in common. And what we have in common, you particularly can take policy form and political form and local government. I think we have much more to agree upon than we do to disagree upon. And somehow politics now has become one of kind of identity or tribal differences. And it seems to me we need to ask the question, what's the good community and what values do we share that we can accentuate and support?
Should Riverside, California be a sanctuary city?
I can't tell you how strongly I disagree with that discussion. I mean, it's all symbolism. It's divisive, it separates, it angers. Riverside now is 55% Hispanic. I think one has to recognize we are a different city than it was when I came and respect that kind of difference. What do you find? We have a kind of history of tolerance, and it's a history that we need to both respect and build upon.
Governor Brown has done a great job.
I'm not really I think there's many good things you can say about Jerry Brown the second time. The first time he spent too much time running for office. He was running for governor, running for president, running for senator. So he was a candidate more than in many ways he was governor. He was governor the last 8 years. My big criticism of Jerry Brown is I was voting for Mayor Brown. And since being elected governor, he has had only passing interest, if that, in cities. And he ended redevelopment, which I think has consequences for the housing market and downtowns and cities across the state. So I
mixed.
Yeah, I would give a mixed verdict to Jerry Brown.
Is Gavin Newsom then the next logical choice?
One, I think he is going to be the choice in November. One of the unfortunate things between Newsom and Brown is that my guess is that during this last 8 years, Jerry has talked to Newsom, probably can't even count on one hand how many times, and their offices are right across the hallway, yet they've had no contact. Contrast to I realize the president chooses the vice president, but at least they do some of this, and I think the unfortunate thing for the state is that Brown and Newsom have been so divorced and separated that he has not had much opportunity to at least be on the inside of the Brown administration.
We've come in close to the end of our time together. There have been so many lovely things said about the both of you. As you step back from public life, as you enter the twilight of your lives, what message do you have for us?
There's a great need to, as you said, to work together, to not get stuck in, a position, a political position, and we need to listen to each other. We need to appreciate people come from different backgrounds and different experiences, and there's probably a lot more that people could agree on than disagree, and to get yourself stuck in a position where there's no room for maneuver it's very destructive to you and to your community. And so I think, just people need to get along.
I guess my basic instructions are related to how we talked about before, is find something that you care about, that maybe find something that you're good at, and then set out to make a difference. It seems to me purpose of life is to try to make society better, to improve the lives of others, and hopefully the kind of testimony that Marcia and I can make can illustrate or underscore or recommend that choice.
Several years ago, he found some memorabilia of my dad's, and he sent it to me. And in a very nice, short message to me, handwritten message to me, he said words to the effect, and these aren't the exact words, but they're close. He said, "Jack, I thought you would like to have these mementos of your father." And he finished it with, "Your father was a citizen."
A number of years ago, I was having dinner with Ted Olson. It was on our wedding party. He's probably been the most successful of the students we were with at University Pacific. But when we were talking, he said, "Well, why devote your life to a city? Why do you want to do that?" And people have to make different choices, but I guess I would offer the argument, as sort of Ed Glaser argument, of the triumph of the city. The city is where people live. It's where things can happen. You're born, you're raised, you die in cities. Many ways, the kind of history of the world is a history of cities and places, and to have a chance to participate in the life and times of a city is not some kind of side adventure. It seems to me it's really the kind of centering of being human. And so I know the tensions often on national, international stuff, but where you can make a difference in people's lives is here in place, and cities offer you that opportunity.
I think Ron's legacy, his great impact, is creative consensus building. He is the kind of person who can introduce a new idea and wait for people to catch up with him. The respect that people hold for him and the respect that people hold for his ideas is a reflection of his ability to bring people together. I think that's his real legacy.
One of the things that made him successful in public life and makes him a good friend is that he listens to people. If you talk to Ron Loveridge, you know that he's paying attention to what you say, and he remembers it, and he cares about it. And that was the way he was in public life, and it's the way he is in his private life.
I think you want to get some kind of life that you indeed have passion about, that you can also make. I mean, I came of age in the late 60s, and Bob Kennedy, as we talked about, has been here. The idea of trying to make some difference in this world, and you only have kind of one time around the track to try to do that, and different people do it in different ways. But politics is a opportunity to make difference and try to make life in a community better for people, better for place.
That commitment to diversity, the commitment to a core, a commitment to civic civility, the commitment to building and growing the civic or human capital of our community That's really his legacy. The legacy of his kind of commitment and his kind of character is this community that's thriving in the midst of some areas that are not doing as well. He is a testament to the principle that leadership matters, and he's still leading.
I think, you know, a lesson I've tried to learn too is to appreciate the moment. You know, each day is a gift. Not to dwell on the past or, you know, what might happen the next day. Life is a constant process of evolving and changing, and in a way there are no certainties. And so I think you need to live in the moment and appreciate it, and be kind to each other.
So you don't, as you get older, you don't have 5-10-year plans, and so you recognize that you need to both value and use the time that you do have.
I just want to say that it is so nice to have a father who is honorable in every way. He is definitely the person you see out, that's him. And so that's a really great quality, I think, in a leader.
And I do think being an academic, having time in office, perhaps doing some reading and thinking about it, that this city is different because I happened to come here rather than go to University of North Carolina or some other place. I think, and I feel I have some pride in that kind of legacy.